Good afternoon. I'm Andy Van Clunen, CEO of National Skills Coalition. And I'm so glad that you could join us for today's Fireside Chat with Juan Salgado, Chancellor of the City Colleges of Chicago. Chancellor Salgado and I are going to talk about a particularly interesting model for economic recovery and reemployment. It's called Future Ready, an initiative created last summer by Chicago's city colleges with the support of federal recovery dollars. It offers high-demand, short-term credentials at no cost to Chicagoans who want to get a new job, advance in their career, or gain the digital skills necessary to keep pace with rapidly changing workplace technologies. I think it's a standout example of how federal funds can be used to connect local residents to skilled jobs in a volatile labor market and to ultimately drive a more equitable, inclusive economic recovery. After I talk to Juan, we'll get reactions from some of my colleagues in the workforce and post-secondary education space about what they're attempting in Chicago and what they think there is a model for other places throughout the country. But first, just a bit more about Juan Salgado. He oversees a college system of 7 colleges and 5 satellites based in communities throughout Chicago, serving nearly 70,000 students, 75% of whom are Black or Latino. And under his leadership since 2017, city colleges have achieved their highest student graduation rates ever. I should mention that Juan and I first came to know each other years ago while he was leading Instituto del Progreso Latino, a nationally recognized community-based education and workforce development organization on Chicago's South Side that has been a leader in NSC's network almost since its founding. Chancellor Salgado, great to see you.
It's great to see you, Andy. Thanks for having me here with you.
I really appreciate you giving me some time this afternoon. All right, let's get into it. Let's start to talk about Future Ready, as part of Chicago's response to the COVID-19 recession. So you know this, but just for folks who are watching, this was an innovation that was made possible due to 2 of the federal recovery packages that were passed in Congress back in 2020 and 2021, CARES 1 and CARES 2. Now, both of those packages provided a lot of relief funds for higher education systems, but most colleges didn't adopt your laser focus on the rapid reemployment of working people, particularly folks of color, lower wage workers who were most impacted by the recession. You and city colleges in Chicago made a different choice. Walk me through a little bit about what the features are of Future Ready and why you thought that this would be an important part of the city's recovery efforts.
Yeah. Well, look, Andy, I think First things first, our students were already struggling before the pandemic, right? I mean, we did a real college survey and we saw high levels of food insecurity, high levels of housing insecurity. I'm talking about 60% of our students identifying both as being either housing and or food insecure. And so, look, pandemic comes, just gets worse, okay? Just gets worse. And so we know that we surveyed our students regularly, right? And during the pandemic, specifically, and learned, it's the financial side of things, right? And so what happens when you have a financial barrier like that is your mindset isn't turning toward the very thing that's going to help you, right? And so we needed to eliminate at least one of those barriers, that gets in the way, and to have a very simple message to students out there. And the simple message is this: it's a Future Ready program. It's 100+ short-term programs. In the criteria is they have to be in high demand occupations that have good career path. It's both continuing education as well as credit bearing programs. And at the end of the day, right, what we're saying to you is it's completely free. All right, now's the time to access this. And so that very simple message getting out to communities basically gets folks to consider the very thing at a very hard time. Let me be clear, okay? Like, it's not an easy decision for someone to come into education because they have to find the time for it. They have to find the space for it. Most of our students are parents themselves in the pandemic, okay? trying to find ways to get ahead. And so, this is the very thing that we need to be doing as an institution to make sure that we're meeting the demands of the marketplace too. Our employers, right, require this from us right now. They require us to be aggressive in going out into the marketplace, because we see too, by the way, that they're hurting. They're hurting because they can't meet the demands of their customer base, because they don't have the supply of workers. And so, this message, a simple message that gets us deeper into the community, is, really necessary at this point in time.
Yeah, and it seemed like, as you said, you were responding to a lot of simultaneous immediate needs, a lot of which preceded the pandemic, and the pandemic just made it worse, right? So folks who were really looking for a better job, folks who needed more family support, particularly if they were going to both try to hold down a job and train for something new or better. That's a lot to kind of manage all at once. How is it that you felt the employers that you were working with, like, how did they come to the table to help you solve some of those problems?
Well, Andy, we've had employers at the table from the start of our work, directing our colleges towards high demand occupations. And so this has been an ongoing, endeavor for us, and continues to be. And so, we continue to consult those employers, but time and time again, the pain point that they have is just not enough pipeline. Mm-hmm. Okay. And so, we have to incentivize, it's happening all over the labor market, by the way. Right now, employers are having to incentivize folks, to, come into their workplaces. We have to incentivize folks to be better prepared so that they can access those opportunities. So the whole, pipeline needs to be incentivized, not because people are sitting back, not wanting to work. Okay, let's be clear about this. It's because we had a pandemic that disrupted their lives in so many different ways, and then they have to bring it back together, right? And so what we're hearing from our employers is, help us to build the pipeline. There's deep concern, and this is why I think, we need to, think about this more broadly than what we're doing in Chicago. So, this is not a temporary challenge that our employers are facing. This is the beginning of a long-term challenge that is only going to get worse if we don't take more aggressive steps to actually solve it, like Future Ready.
Mm-hmm. No, I totally agree with that. Coming back to who it was that was most impacted by the pandemic and the recession that followed, and who was struggling, like you said, even before the pandemic, obviously workers of color, were folks who we wanted to see were going to get a chance to be included in this economic recovery. And about 75% of your students are Black and Latino. So that is whom you are serving through your city colleges. Racial equity was supposed to be a big part of what we were getting out of federal policy over the past year and a half. President Biden put it front and center in what it is he wanted to see coming out of federal recovery efforts. And that includes not just the bills that help fund Future Ready Start, but it's also about the infrastructure bill that just got passed a little while ago. So let's talk a bit about infrastructure, and particularly about where it is that you think the sectors that are going to be most impacted by that, where the jobs are going to be created in Chicago, in construction and clean energy and utilities. Where is it that City Colleges is playing a role with those industries to give more folks of color a chance to get good jobs, long-term careers in those industries, and who have been some of your partners in figuring some of that out?
Yeah. Well, let me just start, and I'm going to go back to Future Ready for a minute, Andy, because we just launched it this fall. Okay, so it's basically 2 semesters in. Okay, we've had 1,774 students take advantage of Future Ready so far. By the way, while our student population is 75%, African American and Latino, Future Ready is 86% Black and Latinx. If you look at where those students are coming from, they're coming from obviously, areas of, higher poverty, lower income communities. And so, this is really, and by the way, that's really important. We didn't do a means test. We got exactly who we were looking for. we didn't make this difficult for them.
Mhm.
Okay, it's enrollment just like any other enrollment, and you don't have to go through a lot of hoops. I would say, like our workforce system, sometimes you have to send in a lot of papers, right? In this case, you don't have to do that. But we are targeting those areas that have historically, have had very few representation, whether it's construction, right? But also areas like aviation technicians,
Mhm.
or diesel and automotive mechanics, right? Or IT. These are places that have had very little representation, and then we're building the partnerships. And so, directly with the employers, but also with the unions.
Mhm.
Okay. There's got to be more direct work with the unions. We did something with the Mid-American Carpenters Regional Council.
Mhm.
It allows journeyman carpenters to apply their education and training experiences towards a degree at Kennedy King College. It allows our students to successfully complete their basic certificate in carpentry. And to be clear, most of our students in these trades, whether it's carpentry or plumbing or any of the other fields, they follow our demographics. They're mostly Black and Latinx. They
Mhm.
don't follow the trends of the unions. Well, now our students, they receive advanced placement in the pre-apprenticeship funds, and they're allowed to get into the actual apprenticeship with the regional carpenters union. So we're doing these very specific things, with these partners. We have a partnership with People's Gas for your utility workers. We have a partnership with ComEd, for folks going in, and ComEd has a specific facility on our location that they've invested in, a direct pathway into jobs with them. We're part of the, in Chicago, a Build Back Better regional coalition, on, the movement towards clean energy. And we're leveraging both our TDL center, but also our advanced manufacturing capabilities in our colleges to really play an important and key role within the growth of jobs in that area. But we're also taking advantage of when you have, legislative changes and opportunities in like cannabis, for instance, growing number of jobs. And so, and working with specific, companies, operators in this space that are growing very rapidly. And we've been able to, open up opportunities. So whether it's new industries or whether it's, old, unionized industries, utility industries, IT companies, we are building the partnerships to make sure that, there's a pipeline from our communities that didn't exist before.
That is just really exciting. And that's going to be good for the future, not just of the folks that you're training. It's going to be good for the future of those industries, because they do need to change who they think is going to be part of their future workforce, and you're helping them do that.
Well, Andy, let me just give you one example. Accenture, okay, in Chicago. We've been working on them for 4 or 5 years now. 5 years ago, they didn't hire a single person from our system.
Mm-hmm.
Because they didn't hire a single person with an associate's degree. Mm-hmm. Fast forward to today, they have hired 75 of our students on a permanent basis at Accenture. These folks are growing within the company. And so that's a difference maker.
Right.
And 60% of those hires come from 15 of the toughest neighborhoods in the city of Chicago.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, that's racial equity.
Right.
That is a company that prior to our work with them was falling far short, if you will, in a city that was falling far short. We turned that around for that company, but also for this city. And so, our big challenge is we need 20 or 30 or 40 Accentures in the marketplace. And so I hope there's people out there. This can't be done. This is not a government solution. It's a private sector solution facilitated through partnerships.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. So let's turn a little bit as we're looking to the future. There's been a lot of talk about how in many ways, the pandemic brought the digitized future right to our front doorstep, right? And I know, your colleges, along with every other college in the country, had to do a bunch of things to change how you, particularly right after the onset of the pandemic, where there was a huge shift to online and remote learning. And for many of your students, there was an additional concern about, do they have access to broadband? Do they have access to digital devices? And do they have the digital skills to even benefit from doing an online learning course if that's not something that they had been doing in the past? So there was a whole education challenge. And then there was the whole industry challenge, right? The industries that, because of reduced headcount and, and shutdowns and things like that, they started bringing digital technology into their sectors in a way that's permanently changed those industries and put a lot of folks at risk, those who don't have digital skills, of being permanently displaced from those sectors. So there's an education challenge around the digital divide. There's a workplace challenge around the digital divide. How is it that City Colleges kind of addressed both of those kinds of issues? And who were some of the key partners that you've been working with to address some of that?
Yeah, I appreciate this. Is so important. This is an access issue.
Yep.
And we're an access institution, right? We have to excel at providing, the most access possible for our students. One of the things I'm proud of is we actually put a team together, in early January 2020, and one of the recommendations was you better buy a bunch of computers and mobile hotspots because, a pandemic could be coming. And so we were ready, by the way, Andy. When we were sent home, we were able to send our students home with a shipment of computers, laptops, and MiFi hotspots. If they didn't have connectivity, we distributed more than 9,000 of those, wow. Right? Sort of like right off the bat. And since then, we've developed an entire program that we didn't have before, right? It's basically a learn to own program. Where when you come in, you get it. You get what you need if you need it, right? And then if you stay with your education, by the time you graduate, you get to keep it, right? I mean, we might charge you a $30 fee or something on your way out, but it's an incentive for students to remain enrolled, but it's also an opportunity for them to get what they need to have. And of course, we've had to expand lots of digital literacy because it's now the primary tool, by the way. Our students, we have choice now at City Colleges. You can now choose. Pre-pandemic, you only had traditional online courses that were asynchronous, and you had regular in person. Now this remote instruction, which we now call Online Live, is an option for you. So as a student, you can take your English 101 class in online live, or you can take it in person, or you could take it traditional. Well, that requires, digital literacy at a whole nother level for lots of other students. And so, this helps align. I want you to know more than 50% of our students are choosing that option on their own because it's efficient for them, right? They can do it from their home if they're parents. If a job shift changes, it's a lot easier. So from a convenience standpoint, and our faculty have gotten quite good about using the medium. And so it's great because it's integrated, right? People are learning as they're actually doing. And so, from my perspective, and I just want to go back to the racial equity, more than 80% of the participants who use the loaner laptops and the MiFi hotspots are Black or Latinx. And so we are working with partners, by the way, to make sure that, we go beyond sending people devices and MiFi hotspots, to something more sustainable. We have something called the Student Tech Equity Program, where we provide free hardwire Wi-Fi in partnership with internet service providers like Comcast, right? And that's working out, really, really well because we need permanent solutions to people's connectivity, not temporary solutions, like the one we had to provide, early on in the pandemic.
Well, so let's talk about permanent solutions. So obviously we've worked for years on both federal and state policy issues around efforts around these issues. We mentioned at the top that one of the reasons you were able to do Future Ready was because the federal government made a decision to invest in recovery in a way that allowed you to do some of these things through those two CARE Acts. But as you know, given how debates have kind of stalled in DC, it may be a while before we get a new flush of investment from Washington that's going to be able to keep Future Ready going. And I know you want to keep it going. We want to see it not just go, we want to see it replicated in a bunch of other parts of the country. So we have to start taking a look at the workforce and higher ed policies that we currently have to see whether or not we can make them better suited to keep things like Future Ready going well into the future. So what are the kind of things that you think, as somebody who knows these policies, what is it you think that we could be doing with our higher ed or workforce policies so that Future Ready could live and expand to serve more Chicagoans in the decade or so ahead?
Yeah, and I appreciate that. Let me just say a few things. First of all, I really appreciate the administration's intentions and with regard to free community college, right? I think that has, lifted up a conversation that is quite healthy. And so the first thing is we got to keep that conversation going, okay, at the federal level. We can't let it die out, no matter who's in office, because this is good for America and every part of America. And it will allow us to sustain things like Future Ready. The big thing is the message that it sends out to people, okay? We all know that we need to do the continuous learning and continuous skill building, right? So if we're not in that business, we're not in the business of growing our economy, and strengthening our national security, which is, tied to a strong economy. So I think the value proposition is, way up there, and people will see it. Now we have to prove that out too, somewhat at the local level, because obviously, even though, much of the president's agenda unfortunately stalled, right? This one piece was abandoned early on, okay? Which is an indicator that we've got some work to do. And so, at the local level, I would just say, we're gonna need to figure this out in the city of Chicago. This is how the best policy has come to fruition, right? You work at the federal level like you do, Andy, and you work, short-term Pell, right? And you work better systems in terms of our workforce development system so that, it allows for more things like Future Ready, okay? I partly did Future Ready because I used to run programs through the workforce system, right? And, it can still be quite cumbersome for the actual participant, right? And so it's not designed in a way that's helpful for the human being. So we have to work through those things, but we have to have, models of doing that locally, okay, and not be reliant. So my focus right now, to be, quite frank, is how to make this work at a local level. How to make sure we're looking at the 100 programs very closely, right, to make sure that we're investing in the ones that are bearing the greatest fruit, which will be important. We're looking at state resources, that are already provided and how they could be more flexible. Here I'm talking about like MAP grants, right? For these kinds of programs. I'm looking at the workforce system, right? What the workforce system, I'm looking at Chicago public schools too, by the way. There's a ton of money that goes into, helping families in communities, right? Through our public schools. So what I'm saying to you, Andy, is maybe some of the resources are already out there. We just haven't figured out how to bring greater ease, how to make the sausage in the background, okay? And we're gonna do the hard work of the sausage making at city colleges for our participants so that it's seamless for them. But once you start doing that, you start to see where the opportunity points are in. So I would say to you, Andy, I think Future Ready is the future. I think that we need to figure out at the federal level how to package this stuff in a simple way that comes to localities, in community colleges and other institutions in a way that is less and less cumbersome so they can focus on the actual delivery of the service. And I do think one thing that I hope we'll continue to push for is this will all require greater wraparound supports. Okay, we need to include, the wraparound supports in the equation. This is not just about quote unquote tuition.
Right.
This is about tuition plus, right? And I know you've been doing really important work there. We certainly are looking at it from that frame as well.
Well, I agree with you. Future ready is the future, and we want to make sure that whatever we can do at National Skills Coalition to support not just the work that you're doing in Chicago, but how we could get other places to adopt some of the things that you're developing there. I know that we're going to get a chance to work on that together in DC, and whatever support we can provide for what you're doing there in Chicago as well. Juan, I just really appreciate it. And I really thank you for spending the time sharing some of this with me today.
Appreciate being here, Andy. It's great to see you. And a big plug for National Skills Coalition. I used to sit on your board. I believe in the work that you do. And as Chancellor of City Colleges, on behalf of our students, our faculty, our staff, we thank you and the entire National Skills Coalition community for what you do on a daily basis, because it does find itself to communities and people.
Thanks, Chancellor. I appreciate it. Good to talk to you.
All right.
Thanks again to Chancellor Salgado. Now let me turn to our expert panel to share some of their reactions to what they just heard. Joining me today are Farhad Asghar. He's the program officer for the Pathways to Post-Secondary Success program at the Carnegie Corporation of New York. Farhad, how you doing?
Doing well, Andy. Good afternoon. Good to see you and be with everyone.
Good to have you here. Next is Matt Summey. Matt's the Vice President for Strategic Planning for Impact and Inclusion for Comcast in Chicago. Matt, thanks for joining us. Matt's muted, but there we go.
Good afternoon. Great to see everyone.
Thanks, Matt. Thanks. And Julie Peller. Julie's the Executive Director of Higher Learning Advocates in Washington, D.C. Hey, Julie, how are you?
Andy, thanks so much for having me here.
Sure thing. So, some really extraordinary work being done in Chicago by the city colleges and their partners. It's really exciting to hear how a group of post-secondary institutions can be so responsive to the needs of a community, when given the right resources and flexibility to meet workers and businesses where their needs are. But I'm curious, I just want to start off by getting some initial reactions from each of you based on what you just heard, some thoughts that you have about what City Colleges is doing with Future Ready and some of the related initiatives. Farhad, I'm going to give you a chance to go first.
I'm going to just jump in and start with Chancellor Salgado's quote: free, high demand, short-term, continuing ed, and credit bearing. It's all about both and, not either or. And to coin to borrow a term from our friends over at Here to Here, access the braided education to employment pathways. And again, honoring the skills people bring in to these spaces that have earned, and apply them to their expertise to a degree. This is a pragmatic both and reality, and just really excited to hear about the great work the Chancellor is leading.
Excellent. Matt, I know you worked with city colleges there in Chicago. Your thoughts about some of the work that they've been doing?
Well, just compliments to Chancellor Salgado and the entire Chicago City Colleges system. If you think about what they're doing, in some ways it should be very obvious. They're an incredibly well-placed jewel that's accessible at so many levels in Chicago, and they've been a resource for decades and an innovator for decades. However, to recognize in this moment the opportunity to take resources and deploy them quickly in a way that was going to upskill and provide new economic opportunity, absolutely terrific work.
I agree. And Julie, what did you think?
Well, I'll jump on the Chancellor's fan club here as well. I think that what they did through Future Ready really showed innovative leadership and putting students and learners at the center. I mean, they really thought about what learners need in this moment, what people need in this moment, and it really showed through all of the different aspects of the program.
I agree. So let's drill down into some of the themes that came up in the conversation. And I know that you have expertise in a bunch of these different areas. Farhad, let me come back to you. There was quite a bit, and I want to build on some of your comments that you just made about how it is that we're thinking about the range of different ways that folks can be interacting with post-secondary institutions and this broader concept of career pathways. The idea is that we think that folks are going to be working and learning in a variety of ways over the course of their careers, and particularly for people for whom this might be their first post-secondary experience. How do you kind of meet them and get them in a way that works for them, even as you're trying to help them advance over time? And this being particularly important for many workers of color who have never had an opportunity to get onto a college campus or into a college program. I'm curious, since you're doing a lot of that work in cities around the country through some of your funding and with your grantees, I'm curious, like, where do you think that resonates with what it is that city colleges are doing in Chicago?
Thanks, Andy. Again, let's just go back to Chancellor Salgado's point when he began by recognizing that many of the challenges faced by the students served by Future Ready existed prior to the pandemic, which underscores the reality, Andy, as we've discussed many times, that our nation must diversify and strengthen options available after high school that honor the needs of all students and communities, simply because lifelong success in the United States is critically dependent on educational attainment. And we know that our post-secondary system, as you noted, as it exists, was not designed to accommodate all learners, especially those who have been historically excluded and intentionally marginalized. And this impacts earning potential and leads to vulnerability and economic disruptions. We saw that during the Great Recession. We're seeing it again today. And again, supporting community colleges is good for America, is good for all Americans. Andy, you and I have also talked about the Carnegie Gallup poll that we surveyed families on these related topics, and 62% share, hey, we want access to 2- and 4-year degrees, and half are also interested in other possibilities. Americans are asking for both and opportunities. There's a growing understanding of braided educating to employment pathways, and Future Ready specifically is addressing elements of the supply problem. We need more to create more programs, and through the Chancellor's deep commitment to community outreach and partnerships with employers, he's also addressing the marketing issue here, right? People who often don't know what's out there, including training and credentialing programs available through community colleges, which are often the site where these kinds of programs are offered on a national level. So this implies a strong immediate need to expand these programs within 2- and 4-year colleges to meet the demand for career learning and support the access for associates and bachelors. And we also need to make sure that young people and adults who aspire to college are prepared for and supported to achieve that ambition. That's why the city colleges of Chicago and other public higher ed institutions across our country what they're doing is so important, because they're leading the way in improving what's possible when colleges become affordable, innovative, and nimble in responding to students' needs. I can keep going on this topic, but I want to make sure that we leave space for my colleagues to agree with me.
I'm curious if anybody have any responses to anything Farhad just lifted up there.
I would pick up on a couple of the themes that he was intimating there. First, accessibility and removing barriers on the cost front. Absolutely essential. City colleges and the Chancellor have done a wonderful job here, but taking it that step further, that conversation around the supply side of this, but doing it in a format that is inviting, welcoming, and supports the lifestyle or the moment that a family or an individual worker may be able to do this in. A couple of days, a couple of hours at a time, welcoming back returning students, removing barriers every time they see one. They deserve a ton of credit for that, but that's what creates the community and helps to drive the economy forward, but it does it in a way that is inclusive for the family, the worker, the individual, and the companies that they'll have an opportunity to work for going forward.
Yeah, Juan mentioned a couple times about how they were trying to, like you said, Matt, reduce those barriers to entry. And Juan has also worked as a funded provider in the workforce system as well. So in every case, like everything that we do that makes it harder for folks to do something different, to get into a training or education program, to kind of change their career trajectory, we should be removing those barriers and making it as easy as possible for them to get in and get out and then continue on with their career as they go. So I think that really resonates with some of the things that he lifted up. Matt, let me come back to you, because we also talked a lot about digital equity and the digital divide with Chancellor Salgado. And knowing that there are different elements to that. Certainly broadband access is incredibly important. and having access to devices so that folks can use that broadband. But then in addition, making sure that folks also have the digital skills necessary to take advantage of that technology, whether it's learning at home or it's in keeping up with how things are changing in their workplaces. And I know Comcast has played a big role in helping city colleges and folks in Chicago in general deal with those kinds of issues. But I'm curious if you have anything more to kind of add to give us some more flavor about what's been happening in Chicago on those issues.
Yeah, certainly, Andy. And thanks for the opportunity to talk about this. I think we actually need to take a step back sometimes and break it down into there's access and there's adoption. And in a major metropolitan area like Chicago, access is everywhere. There are multiple providers, but there may be other barriers that are precluding a household from getting connected to broadband. It could be a cost factor. It could be a competence issue. It could be comfort. And that really comes to play in the way that city colleges and Comcast have worked together in the past. Digital inclusion means that you've got to meet people where they are. And that could mean we're all familiar with what a router is, maybe how to adjust our Wi-Fi. We may be talking about individuals who don't have that level of comfort. So we've got to help them navigate that system in a way that works for the way that their life happens to be operating. The pandemic laid bare so many things, the first of which was those who did not have that connection needed to get a connection. Then we could get to the applied side work. So we very quickly worked with Mayor Lightfoot's office and Chicago City Colleges on an initiative called Chicago Connected, and we continue to grow it. But it is, product specific broadband available to anyone who has a need that meets certain eligibility criteria. And we've got 60,000 homes that are now connected through this program, mostly through Chicago Public Schools. But as those students graduated and moved on to city colleges, that connectivity went with them. And two important points on that, and this is the adoption side of it. This is a whole home service. It isn't a hotspot. This is a wired connection with a Wi-Fi router. So everybody in the family or anybody in the household has that opportunity to use it at a level that can support work, learning, or other things. But more importantly, and this is where city colleges, I think, really is leading the way nationally, that perspective isn't just simply about the connection. We all recognize that's foundational. Now that gateway is set and we've got more that we can do, and that's where the educational opportunities grow. But if you're connecting with those families, what else might be available beyond just a city college's class? Are there opportunities to do non-credentialed education? Are there financial literacy or skill development opportunities? Let's build on that platform and do more. And I think about it in many respects like a caseworker would, which is there are all of these things that we can ladder up, but let's ask what those needs are. And if we don't get a response, let's ask again in a different way that's inclusive.
I completely agree, and credit to Comcast to recognizing, even as you are a telecom provider, there's a technology set of things that need to be solved here, but there's a human part of the solution as well. And how is it that we're investing in people to make sure that they have an opportunity to actually make use of the broadband and devices that we are now putting in more homes than we've had before? And certainly this is going to be an ongoing question in the context of how we're going to be implementing this federal infrastructure bill. We have a new Digital Equity Act, and to the Biden administration's credit and to Congress's credit, it's not just about broadband and devices, it is also about digital skills. How is it that we're making sure that folks are acquiring those and using this technology as one of the ways that they're going to be developing that? So Julie, since I just brought up federal policy, I want to pivot to you as the policy expert here on our panel. So, we talked about a lot of different things with Chancellor Salgado, from like big game-changing federal policies that haven't gotten across the finish line yet, like free community college, to kind of more immediate things that we could be doing with our higher ed and workforce development systems and even our human service systems to make it easier for people to achieve the kinds of things that Future Ready is achieving with city colleges in Chicago. So I'm curious your thoughts about this, like in terms of the policy issues that came up in that conversation. What have you been thinking about to make more Future Readies possible in other cities around the country?
Quite a few things. And in fact, that was the one point of the chancellor's talk with you that I kind of disagreed with, where he said, this isn't a government solution. I think there's a lot government can do, frankly, in a lot of ways to get out of the way, to make it possible for more chancellors to be able to do this kind of innovative public-private partnership. Braiding funding, I think, is a huge thing. To Farhad's point, it's not an either or for learners. It's not an either or for colleges anymore, but our policies and the way that we fund the systems force that either or choice. So I think from a big think perspective, that is one mind shift that policymakers have to make. We have to not silo individuals and programs into workforce or higher education and make it possible for the both and. The second kind of big thing that jumped out to me from a policy perspective is that wraparound student support. Just to pull on the broadband conversation that we were just having, to Congress's credit, included Pell students as eligible participants for the emergency broadband benefit, and now permanently as the American Connectivity Program. We never thought of college students before as a needy population for these kind of supports. So, we thought about that with broadband access, but we know that's also true in housing and transportation and childcare, all these other things that are critical to learning success, just as they are critical to meeting basic needs. So I think that's kind of the second big chunk. The big thing, and the chancellor brought up free community college, but stepping out of the immediate political and policy debates of that particular proposal, I think better investment in the institutions that are providing these services has to happen. We have not thought about and really quite invested at the national level in our community colleges in a way that's sufficient for not only the City College of Chicago and well-resourced institutions like that, but all community colleges and even smaller communities to provide these kind of innovative solutions.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. And so we have institutional investments that we need to make to maintain and expand that infrastructure, that learning infrastructure. In terms of what we could be doing for individual students and workers themselves, you mentioned support services, and obviously the chancellor brought that up as well. But what are things that we could be doing on the tuition assistance side and other ways that we're going to make it easier for folks to get into some of these kinds of programs like Future Ready?
So, I think providing Pell Grants to our lowest income students, no matter the program that they provide, even the chancellor talked about short-term Pell quite a little bit briefly, but I think that really opens the doors for individuals who need shorter term training that can then be connected to a longer learning pathway, should they so choose, but gets them the training they need, the job they need, and opens the door to future opportunities. So I think opening up the Pell Grant to those learners and those programs would be incredibly helpful. Another kind of non-tuition and textbook costs need to be addressed. The success and the investment in things like emergency aid that we saw through the pandemic are there. As the chancellor said, those needs were there before the pandemic. They're going to be there after the pandemic. And emergency costs, a car tire needing to be replaced, or an emergency childcare situation, or a medical bill can really derail somebody's learning opportunity, no matter the length, no matter whether it's continuing education or for credit. And I think it's a responsibility and a completion strategy to invest on that side as well.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. For Hadermet, any reactions? Yeah?
Absolutely. A round of applause. Julie, thank you for bringing that up. I mean, we definitely need a one system approach, allowing people to seamlessly transition across post-secondary pathways, right? People don't necessarily follow a straight line from high school into higher ed into the workforce. So we need a system with those on-ramps and off-ramps that better aligns with that reality, as Julie noted. Again, another plug for community colleges. A lot of this work, the existing infrastructure, however badly we've been funding it, to Julie's point, this infrastructure already does exist, and a lot of this vision can be realized in community colleges where some of this work is already underway. And then pivoting back to those comprehensive wraparound social services and career learning, offering professional development for individuals, transitioning from careers, preparing people for these in-demand careers that honor the need of local communities is critical. And if you'll indulge me, Andy, just to kind of go back to Matt's and Julie's point about how digital equity is educational and economic equity, right? We can't talk about solving educational and economic disparities without addressing digital inequality. And community colleges are great places to help inform students about all of all of the social services that they're entitled to, and community colleges are at the forefront of realizing this. And then lastly, so many folks who engage in credential programs, for example, might need digital skills basics prior to completing those programs. So it's just ensuring digital resiliency is really ensuring this country's resiliency as well.
Absolutely. You saw a lot of head nodding for me. I think so many good points raised. We'll bring one more to the table that the chancellor has been on the forefront of. It's the employer conversation. Credentials that don't apply in the workforce, they're not meaningless. Skills always matter, and we will find ways to apply them. And we should always celebrate that opportunity to learn and to build and to think analytically. But that employer conversation, so that transition between classroom and back to work, which often is happening simultaneously, as we all know, that is a really powerful aspect of this. And the partnerships that have formed here in Chicago, but are forming around the country, and that conversation between what education means in the workforce and what the workforce means in education, that link can only get stronger because it will benefit all of us.
Absolutely. And Julie, this is something that I know we mentioned, the free community college proposals that never got across the finish line. But there were other proposals from the administration specifically on this issue around community college and industry partnerships that I still think have some opportunity to get some traction. I'm curious if you think that's part of the conversation we could be having in DC over the next year or so.
Absolutely. I think that especially as Congress and the country turn toward economic recovery, health recovery, all sorts of recovery, maybe turning the corner out of the pandemic, that investments in these kind of partnerships, investments in these systems must be at the forefront. We won't get there if people don't have the opportunity to regain the skills and talent that they need to participate in the new economy. So I think that there's opportunity, as those conversations kind of begin and continue, through the fall and the beginning of next year.
Yeah. Well, I anticipate that all of us hopefully will be part of some of those conversations with folks in Washington or back in some of the states where we're doing work. This has been a great conversation, so I hope it's not the last that the four of us have on these issues. But Farhad, Matt, and Julie, thanks so much for joining me for this conversation today, and looking forward to more conversations down the road.
Thank you, Andy.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Sure thing. I'm so glad that you could join us for today's Fireside Chat with Juan Salgado, Chancellor of the City Colleges of Chicago. Chancellor Salgado and I are going to talk about a particularly interesting model for economic recovery and reemployment. It's called Future Ready, an initiative created last summer by Chicago's city colleges with the support of federal recovery dollars. It offers high-demand, short-term credentials at no cost to Chicagoans who want to get a new job, advance in their career, or gain the digital skills necessary to keep pace with rapidly changing workplace technologies. I think it's a standout example of how federal funds can be used to connect local residents to skilled jobs in a volatile labor market, and to ultimately drive a more equitable, inclusive economic recovery. After I talk to Juan, we'll get reactions from some of my colleagues in the workforce and post-secondary education space about what they're attempting in Chicago and what they think there is a model for other places throughout the country. But first, just a bit more about Juan Salgado. He oversees a college system of 7 colleges and 5 satellites based in communities throughout Chicago, serving nearly 70,000 students, 75% of whom are Black or Latino. And under his leadership since 2017, city colleges have achieved their highest student graduation rates ever. I should mention that Juan and I first came to know each other years ago while he was leading Instituto del Progreso Latino, a nationally recognized community-based education and workforce development organization on Chicago's South Side, has been a leader in NSC's network almost since its founding.